Hi guys, it's Eric with the Film Photography channel. Let's take a look at the Nikon F3. The Nikon F3 was by far one of Nikon's most popular professional cameras. As you can see, this one is pretty well outfitted here. I don't really use it like this anymore, but when I first got it, I was just so into this camera, I started buying up accessories for it. But in any case, it's the third of the F series, preceded by the F and the F2 and variants of the F2 like the A and the AS and on. This camera sold 21 years. That's how long this camera was in production. This camera was in production after the F4 was released and after the F5 was released. That's just how popular this camera was. Now, one thing that most photographers of the day were not really open to or receptive of was an electronic camera. This camera has an electronic shutter, so therefore it needs batteries to operate. More on that later. And photographers of the day were scared to death of that. I mean, that was just a non-starter for most of them. So you know, it's a little odd that it started off that way and then ended up being just one of the most popular cameras ever made. This is an absolutely gorgeous camera. It's just, you know, it's a beautiful design. The materials are just first rate. I mean, I'm looking at the coating and the switches and everything else. It's just, you know, it's just as nice as they come. This particular one is kind of mint. You know, I paid a little extra for it. I've had it since 2011. So I've used this camera for quite a while, and I used to use it with this the MD4 motor drive that you see on the bottom here all the time. And this is the SB17 flash. I've used it, and I'll show you how these items work as well. All right, so what we've got here, this is as you know, the Nikon F3 with the HP finder, what they call the high eye point viewfinder. This viewfinder had a larger opening, and it allowed a much easier viewing, like with glasses and such. It pretty much became the standard model soon after it was released, because they released it with a different viewfinder that just wasn't anywhere near as nice and as bright as this one. So pretty quickly it became the standard model. Notable thing about this flash and about this camera is, if you notice where the flash is attached, it's got like a sleeve or socket that goes over the rewind lever. It's got a removable viewfinder, as you can see. There's so many pieces that can be removed. Obviously the lens. It's an SLR, interchangeable lens, SLR system camera. And I'm not going to do it now, but the focusing screen is interchangeable. They had around 22 focusing screens available for this camera. I happen to have an optional viewfinder here. Now, this is the DW3, and what this does is it replaces the HP finder, as you know, just as an optional finder. And why would you want to do that, you say? Because this particular finder allows waist level viewing. Okay, now this is a surprisingly handy thing to have. It has a oh, here it is. It has a little pop-up magnifying glass. You know, so you can, you know, put your eye right there on top of it, and for critical focusing. I actually use this a lot when I do macro photography, because you know, as you can see, it's easier to view the camera from the top than it is from the back if you've got the camera sitting on a tripod and it's, you know, relatively low or whatever. So, you know, it's a neat little accessory, and it's surprisingly nice and bright, even with this focusing screen that's in there now. Okay, up top here we've got the film count window, film advance lever, shutter release. This is the shutter speed dial. You can set the shutter speeds from 8 seconds. You see in orange there, those are full seconds, right on up to 1/2000th of a second, which was actually relatively fast. shutter speed for its day. And this is a aperture priority camera, so you can set it to A, and this is a locking dial here. So you set it to A, and then the camera will choose the shutter speed based on the aperture that you select. All right, and right here, this is the multiple exposure dial. You just flip this out. Kind of an odd looking little switch, kind of like a pointy little switch. But anyway, once you flip that out, you'll take a double exposure. If you flip it out again, and you'll notice the film counter won't advance. Okay, it'll just kind of stay where it is until you stop flipping that little switch out. One thing this camera did not have, while it does have a shutter or a eyepiece blocker, eyepiece curtain here, you see it in red. It didn't have, well, actually, it didn't have a built-in diopter, but I believe there were little diopter lenses for your glasses prescription that you could twist into, screw into there. But it didn't have like the newer SLRs, like the little thing you turn to change the diopter in the viewfinder. This button here is the depth of field preview button, and also at the base of that button, this is the mirror lockup. Okay, and I'll show you what that looks like real quick. You see that? You got to push the depth of field preview down first, and then you can lock the mirror right up. And that's, as I'm sure we all know, that's used for like long exposure photos, or any situation where you want to minimize the mirror slap. And speaking of which, it's not insignificant on this camera. It does have a little bit of a slap. It's not terrible, and the body, you don't really feel the body vibrating. But it sounds really controlled and really well engineered. I mean, the camera is great, but the mirror does have a little bit of a slap. Okay, moving on. Like I mentioned earlier, this camera the shutter's fully electronic, so it does need the batteries to for the shutter to actuate, except for this switch here. And this little feature was put in to quell some of the anxiety that the professional photographers of the day had, and the fear that they had of using a fully electronic camera. Because all cameras before this were pretty much mechanical. So what Nikon came up with is this switch here that will release the shutter at 1/60th of a second. So this button here in the center of the manual shutter release, this button right here is the exposure lock. Okay, so if you're gonna take an exposure reading and then recompose, you just hold this button down, and I do it like this, and then you're good to go. You can hold this button down, because if you let it go, it's gonna start reading exposure again. So you hold it like this, and then you're free to release the shutter at the whatever exposure you locked in. This little red button here is a light. You just push it in, and you get you see that light coming on there. And the reason for that light is to light up the you see you have your aperture clicks there. You notice on these Nikon lenses, the AIS lenses, and others, I think the AFD as well, they have tiny little numbers there that show you the aperture, and then the bigger ones obviously are just for you to look at on the lens, and then you've got your depth of field preview scale. But these tiny little buttons show up, these tiny little numbers show up inside this little viewer window here. There's like a little tiny window that you can see inside the viewfinder that shows you what aperture you're set on. Okay, and that light obviously just lights up the little numbers there, so you can see it inside the viewfinder when it's dark. And it also lights up the LCD display inside the viewfinder. These two skis here are what you slide the flashes on, that are available for this camera. Rewind knob, of course, and these are the contacts for said flash. Exposure compensation is only ±2. It's not a lot. And then you've got your pull-up ring here, for your to set your ISO, or we call it ASA back in the day. Looking at the bottom real quick, tripod socket, of course. These are the contacts for the motor drive, the MD4 motor drive. There's normally a little cover there, a little screw-on cover. Screw-on cover can be conveniently stored inside here, right? And it was in there, and it's lost. And I'm not sure how that happened, because I had it in there for quite a while. Anyway, but yeah, just finishing up here. This, so that you've got here the battery. This is where your 2-button batteries go. This is the mechanism that actually moves the film. You know, the motor drive connects to that to advance the film. And this is the rewind knob, and this is just like an alignment hole there for the tab, for the motor drive. Oh, and I forgot one thing here: the self timer. This is the self timer indicator. In order to actuate the self timer, you rotate that knob there. You'll see the red dot, and when you hit the release there, you've got about a 10-second delay, and the self timer will actuate the camera with that fast flash at the end there. Another thing that's kind of just noteworthy about this camera is, and I did talk about the quality a little bit, but I mean, it's not a heavy camera. It is, but it's certainly substantial. I mean, you do feel it. You know, again, it's not terribly so. The quality, though, like I said, it's just there. I mean, every single knob, and this is an old camera, but every single knob, button, you know, bell, whistle, you name it, just exudes quality. It's just such a nice performing camera. I've had other Nikons. I've had an FE2. I've got an FE right now. I mentioned how nice the Olympus OM2 that I've got now is, and they're all nice cameras, and they're all really well made. But this one is just a next level type of construction. It's just a really, really nicely constructed camera. The film advance lever is easily the best in the industry for film cameras. I have not used another camera, and I've used Leica SLRs. Of course I use Leica rangefinders, contacts, made a nice SLR, but I don't think any of them are quite as smooth as this Nikon, the film advance. I know it's not a big deal, but when you're using the camera, every time you advance the film, it's just like, you know, it's like butter. I mean, and this film advance lever, it's got ball bearings in there, is my understanding, which is part of the reason it's as smooth as it is. You know, as we know, the F3 is a system camera, so it's, you know, it's got a ton of accessories that are available for it. You know, that's been made for it. These huge, crazy bulk film backs, data backs that imprint the, you know, information on the film as you're taking it. In case the MD4 is just a really same thing. I mean, just really well put together. I will mention one thing. It definitely adds some heft to the camera. It's heavy, okay? It's got 8 AA batteries in here, and it's not especially light by itself, because again, it's a professional camera, and this is made mostly of metal. So yeah, it's, you know, it's got to be durable. But yeah, these 8 batteries here, they definitely add a little weight to the whole deal, to the whole camera. Now, just to show you the back here real quick, these contacts I believe are for the bulk film back and probably for other accessories. Once the MD4 is attached to the Nikon F3, the MD4 takes over the power functions for the camera. Okay, in other words, the button batteries, I mean, and I've used it with the button batteries even removed. The motor drive does everything. Okay, and so what these 2 LEDs did here, they're multifunctional LEDs, but one of the functions is the battery check. So you press the battery check button here, And if you get 2 LEDs that light up just like we've got right now, then you're good to go for the fastest frame rate. All right, and once you've hit the end of your film roll, I believe it's this LED will light up, and the MD4 will actually rewind the film for you. Now, it doesn't do so automatically, but the first thing to do is just to slide this over, and you'll notice these buttons or these sliding switches here. This one's labeled 1, this one's labeled 2, and so what you do, you slide this one to the left first, and then that releases this one so you can slide it up, and now if there were film in there, it would be rewinding it. Okay. In its literature, Nikon mentions that if you do this automatic rewinding in cold weather, you may end up getting some static electricity, which could end up resembling like lightning bolts on your exposed film. So that they recommend that instead of using this auto rewind feature, if you're in really cold weather, just to go ahead and rewind your film normally with the good old crank here. All right, so Nikon made an accessory for the MD4 for the motor drive that actually fit. It's screwed into the tripod socket here, and it was just a little plate. I'll show you a picture of it. That fit under here, and it gave it a wider stance. And I've read that, and I've never tried this myself, but that once that MK1 is in place, that it'll allow the F3 to sit up with a 200 millimeter, I think it was an F4 AIS lens of its day. It could actually hold up a 200 millimeter lens without toppling over. Okay, which it put the tripod socket in the middle where it should be, but it also gave you a vertical shutter release. It actually would, and I may actually get one. I don't have one, but it gives you the vertical shutter release somewhere in here, just like a modern day DSLR. So you get that secondary release. The F3 had just tons and tons of accessories. It was the ultimate system camera. It had an intervalometer, which was the size of I don't know, a small computer or something that you might see nowadays. It actually wasn't that. It was a box about that big that gave you the intervalometer. It had wireless release. You could actually release the shutter wirelessly. I mean, just too many items to mention here, for the scope of this video. But I will show one thing. When I say that the Nikon F3 was a professional camera, I'm prepared to prove it. Okay, for its day, again, this camera was started in the 80s, but as you see, I've got the SB17 flash attached to it. And this flash, it's got several different settings. It's got TTL, it's got a regular auto setting, it's got a manual setting, but manual is just the full strength. The F3 actually has an LED indicator inside the viewfinder that lets you know if the flash exposure it was metered correctly, if you had a good photo or not. And it couldn't tell you that when the bounce is engaged. Anytime you bounce, it's going to tell you pretty much every time that the flash exposure was not right. So I found if I'm using bounce, I'll just compensate one and a half stops, and it'll be a good photo. But in any case, the one setting that I think is really cool is the MD setting, because these items were obviously made to work well together. Anyway, you put it in the MD setting. MD stands for motor drive, and with a nice fresh set of batteries, this is what you get. Okay, and I'll see how that looks on video. That may be a bit of a disaster video-wise, but we'll see how that comes out. But yeah, I will tell you that most cameras of today can't do what you just saw this camera do. This oddball, flash mount, you can actually replace it or accessorize it with this guy right here. Okay, it slides on, and then you twist the collar, and it puts it in place. But this is actually a Vivitar, so you can use a conventional flash. Okay, and as you see, it's got the 2 extra contacts for TTL. Just looking at the beautiful, iconic design of this camera, what made this Nikon F3 unique and really a vast departure from what Nikon had been doing previously. You know, if you look at the Nikon F, and which is also an iconic camera, but you look at the Nikon F and the F2, they don't look anything really like this camera. They were, more of a tool. This is more of I would call it a work of art. I actually take a lot of pictures of this camera. I take a lot of pictures with the camera, but I also take a lot of pictures of this camera. I've got I've taken probably over 100 pictures over the years of this camera because it's just such a beautiful design. And the reason for that is this camera was designed by a famous Italian designer, Giorgetto Giorgiaro. I hope I said that right. And one thing that he did, one accent that really just stuck throughout the Nikon line was this red accent here, this little red line, which you still see in Nikons of today. He designed not just the F3, but he also designed the F4, F5, and F6. Okay, and he also designed the Volkswagen Scirocco. He also designed several Ferraris. I believe he designed the first Volkswagen Golf. He designed the DeLorean, the Back to the Future car. So he's got quite a resume and most of his designs were that of in the automobile industry. He designed cars mostly, so it's kind of cool that somebody that's that well known in the car industry designed this camera for Nikon. Okay, the meter on this camera is something that I really want to talk about. It is a phenomenal metering camera. Now this is pre-matrix metering. Nikon, I believe, developed matrix metering with the F5. So this is pre-matrix metering. Nikon hadn't developed the matrix metering system yet. But so I'll show you this photo that I took. I believe it was at around F11, if I recall, and at night on a tripod. So anyway, I just let, and I believe it was, I used Ektar, which would be an ISO 100. It ended up taking an 8-minute exposure that came out perfectly exposed. You can see the photo here. The street lights weren't like blown out or underexposed. I mean, it exposed perfectly for that. And that's been my experience with this camera. The meter is just top notch. Nikon continued to manufacture the F3 from 1980 to 2001, selling over 750,000 units, which is the longest run and the most units ever sold for any professional grade SLR. While I owned this Nikon F3, I had the D200, I had a D300, I had a D7000, I had a D7100, I had a D7200. Very recently, I got rid of my D500 and replaced it with a D810. But if you think about all those digital cameras that I had, this camera is still, as good as it was then, and it's just a camera that is just as relevant as when I had that D200. I mean, if you think about a D200 nowadays, it's just not, this takes much better photos than the D200 does. And it just, it's not a camera that I think anybody's really seeking out nowadays. It's pretty much gone the way of obscurity at this point. Nikon made lots of variants of this camera, as you can imagine, because they sold it for so long. There was the F3T, which was a titanium camera. It was really robust and tough camera. It was initially sold, like, instead of the black paint, a champagne color, but later on it was sold in black. They also built the F3P, which was designed primarily for photojournalists, and it actually had weather sealing. It was probably Nikon's first weather sealed camera. Nikon made the F3H. So along with the F3H, Nikon also made the
MD4H, which was a specialized version of the MD4 motor drive, which allowed you to shoot at 13 frames per second.
The mirror let 30% of the light up into the pentaprism, so the photographer can see the picture, and 70% of the light went through the mirror. So it was like a translucent, I guess you'd call it, a mirror that allowed 70% of the light to hit the film. And finally, they came up with the first autofocus. I believe the first autofocus Nikon. They called it the F3 AF. I want to say there was only 2 or 3 lenses that Nikon made for it, and it never really went anywhere. And while this was a wonderful film camera, this body in this configuration was actually the first digital camera. Kodak came up with the DCS 100, which is this contraption that actually used the Nikon F3 as the camera part of their first digital sensor and digital camera setup. Yeah, so one little quirk about the Nikon F3 is once you load the film in there, initially, and it's set on auto mode anyway, you are, for the first, I think it's 3, yeah, for the first 3 frames, this camera stays on 1/80th of a second. And I'm not sure why that is. I mean, I could imagine it's for consistency. You do get 36, if it's 36 frames, if it's a 36 frame roll, but it's just kind of odd that, it doesn't let you, I mean, it takes the picture, but you're going to be stuck on 1/80th no matter what for the first 3 frames. Just a little tidbit. Okay, guys, so that's the Nikon F3. I love this camera. I'll probably never get rid of it. I've had it for a long time. I use it all the time. This and my Leica M6 are hands down my 2 favorite cameras, film cameras, and I highly recommend. You can pick one of these up for like $100, in okay condition. If you want a nice minty one like this, maybe 150, 180. You can get a rough one for 50 or 60 bucks with dents and dings and scratches all over it, but it'll more than likely still work just fine. It's a tough, durable camera. It's extremely well engineered. It's a pleasure to use. When you pick it up and you're taking photos with it, you feel like you're working with a really finely tuned machine. So anyway, go get you a Nikon F3.